This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Dahlia Shendlin.
And I'm Gilad Halpern.
This episode is brought to you by the Israel Democracy Institute, an independent center of research and action dedicated to strengthening the foundations of Israeli democracy. Every week, we interview authors of books and research that we find interesting. If you like us, please consider supporting us on Patreon. You'll find out all about it on our homepage, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review.
Our guest today is Yuval Feldman, professor of law at Bar-Ilan University and a senior fellow at the IDI. His book, The Law of Good People, Challenging State's Ability to Regulate Human Behavior, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2018. And today we will harness his expertise in behavioral analysis of regulation, enforcement and compliance to discuss how trust in the state has affected the response to the COVID pandemic, with a focus on Israel, of course. Professor Yuval Feldman, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello, pleasure to be here.
So if we look at the pandemic globally, the US, Israel and the UK have all had severe waves at points during this pandemic. And there's one thing about them, that there's a certain political culture, a populist culture of the leadership that characterizes them. Do you think that this kind of governance generate particular problems for successful management of the pandemic?
Well, first of all, I think in general, being a democratic state limits your ability to fight pandemics. I think the fact that you need to account for so many human rights, and I'm happy to live in a country that respects them, but we have to understand there's so many limitations for effective measures that countries can employ to fight the pandemic, which are limited in democratic countries. So, concerns for privacy prevents using various technological measures. There are limits to the sanctions you can use. You need to account for public support. So this is, in a sense, the good side. The bad side might be a situation where professionals or substantive considerations governments use to fight the pandemic sometimes mix with political ones. So if you think about the short term and your ability to satisfy various, voter or communities that might not support you if you impose restrictions on them, this might cause you not to engage in long-term professional, purely medical concerns that are affecting your policy. So in that regard, the notion of this populist or too much kind of thinking about how popular you are within the public in the short term might prevent your ability to fight the pandemic.
Can you think of any good guideline for balancing this need to preserve rights in a democracy and individual rights and what seems to be the ideal from a medical health perspective, that the government would just have total control over how people function day to day?
I think this is a huge challenge, and I think this will affect public policy and legal policy in years to come, how we kind of balance the kind of command and control approach, where things are mandatory and we expect people to behave in a certain way and we sanction them for not complying with those requirements, and the questions of how much can countries trust their own citizens or residents in behaving responsibly. So in a sense, this is kind of, I think, the delicate balance. You definitely, and I think the behavioral analysis of law tells us that we're going to get much better compliance from people and better cooperation if they believe in it, if they understand it, if they feel that they are being respected, if accounts of procedural justice, trust, all of those principles are being respected and governments follow them, all those things going to lead to better compliance. The question is, what do you do with substantial minority in any given population in any country who will only cooperate if you force them? So how do you engage in this balance? How do you get the majority of people to cooperate, ideally with intrinsic motivation? So when they actually believe in what they do, they understand why they are being asked to wear a mask and so far and so on, with a certain population that exists in every country. I mean, this is not an Israeli thing, which will only comply if you force them and if you sanction them. And the behavioral analysis tells us a lot about the cost of sanctions. So if you impose sanctions on people, the level of compliance in many activities will not be as good. So we have a lot of research showing that when people are doing things not because they believe in them, but only because they are forced to engage in them and they have to without fully understanding, they will do it only in the places where you can actually verify their behavior. And if you think about the COVID crisis, there are so many situations when enforcement is not going to work. I mean, you cannot monitor people, again, in a democratic state, you cannot monitor people's behavior in their yards or in their private homes. It's very hard to even, again, without technology, to even make sure that people who need to be in isolation will stay in their houses. There aren't enough police officers to find everyone. Even most of the fines, I think the statistics is that more than 2/3 of the fine during the COVID crisis in Israel were not paid. So this all suggests how limited is the ability to use sanctions. And therefore, this is kind of, I think this will be, and I think we'll learn so much about the whole kind of area of compliance and voluntary cooperation from COVID. And I don't have a good answer what's the balance, but just that we need to think really hard and take into account all the considerations of the pros and cons of taking each approach and try to understand in which context one approach is better than the other.
So it's not clear-cut. I'd like to know whether you think that Israel has gone too far with enforcement and not far enough with generating trust among the public.
Well, I think, again, it's not just whether you rely on sanctions, is how do you do it? So if people feel, for example, that sanctions are being imposed based on political motivations, based on what are the activities which are easier to monitor, not by what activities are most dangerous, then not only you use sanction and so you do all this kind of destruction of intrinsic motivation, you also harm trust. Because if people see and say, how come all those, schools in the ultra-Orthodox communities are open for a month now, they hardly get any fines, but I open my very small shop where only one customer can go in and I get this 5,000 new Israeli shekels fine for that, I feel something is wrong here. So it's not just that when it's better to have fines and when it's better to try and convince the public or have them understand why we need to have those regulations in place to fight the pandemic, it's how you do it. And I think so far, I can't say that the fines are too high. I think in an international perspective are even relatively low. But I think is the feeling that they are not being applied equally. This is, I think, the main problem.
In one of your recent articles about this, you wrote about the distinction between generating policy based on epidemiological versus behavioral aspects. Can you explain that distinction and why you think it's important?
Well, I think it's important to understand that we all know it. It's just that people respond not just to what's the right thing to do. So when you tell them, do that because this is the right thing to do, you also need to understand that in many situations, people will not do the right thing in a given situation. So we need to understand how complex, how bounded is people's cognition. And when we expect them to do something, it's not necessarily the case that even if it's the right thing to do from a medical perspective, they're exactly going to do the same thing. You have to understand how people make decisions to be able to create a policy which will actually change their behavior in the right way. And I'm afraid that sometimes, and I too believe that in the treatment of this pandemic, medical doctors should get priority over behavioral scientists. I'm not saying, we are the most important type of researchers, but since it's not just a medical issue, you engage in causing so many people to change their normal life, you need to understand people's behavioral limits. You need to understand, this new thing about the fatigue. At some point, people cannot follow so many orders for so long. You need to keep thinking all the time about what will cause people to engage in a sustainable behavioral change. It's not just this is the right thing to do from an epidemiological perspective, and then people will do it. People are not machines, they're more complex, and if we don't take that into account, we're just not going to get to the goal we wish to get to with their population behavioral change.
Is there anything in the Israeli state of mind, culture, political culture perhaps, that is intrinsically problematic? I mean, the Israelis' reputation, for being unruly and cutting corners. I mean, it's a lot of folklore, but I'm assuming there's some truth in that as well. And also, I mean, the political culture, the fact that there were quite a few government ministers who were caught defying the rules that they themselves set for fighting the pandemic. How difficult it is really, regardless of the current crisis itself. I mean, even in projecting about future responses, are there really any of these parameters that are structurally problematic?
Just to point out that we've seen incidents of government ministers breaking regulations related to the pandemic in other countries too. So how much of this is unique to Israel?
So that's a hard question, and I think maybe the most unique characteristics of Israelis is their very low cultural self-esteem of the country. So I wouldn't lie, and I would say that in many international ranking, Israel is not too high on many measures. I would have liked Israel to be higher. So things related to rule of law and social capital and trust, we have to improve, I think, relative to the countries we are interested in comparing ourselves to. Having said that, I think, for example, Google, who's monitoring the movement, following kind of the restrictions, and so they can basically tell in a very accurate way what's the level of compliance in Israel relative to other countries. I don't think we did poorly on those comparisons. I think the fact that we have this very low self-view of our country is harming the behavior. So this became some sort of kind of self-fulfilling prophecy where if you don't believe people will comply, you end up not complying, and so the norm deteriorates. So we have this kind of pluralistic ignorance where we believe that many people don't respect the rules, and you see that in many studies in Israel, in other countries, where people have this kind of pessimistic view about the social norm, and this in itself leads to reduced compliance. And I think as Israelis, we are even worse in that. We, for various reasons, some of them beyond my own research, so maybe more sociological or anthropological reasons, we have a very negative view about ourselves. So as you pointed, we are not the only country with politicians who broke COVID regulations, but I think we kind of taken it, to suggest so many bad things about us. Even our president and prime ministers and senior ministers, no one, and we forget that, and this is, some of it is the media focus, right? So we only see in the TV the, people in weddings, either in the Arab sector or in the ultra-Orthodox sector, we see hundreds and thousands of people without face masks, and we see in the media from the beach sometimes, but we forget that still the majority comply, but they never get to TV. And just having this kind of perception of the social norm, I think is constructive. And I understand the media. I mean, it's not interesting to show a picture of someone sitting in his house, right? But still...
Well, I think I'm very interesting when I sit in the house.
Yeah. So yeah, I think I think we do have problems with many things. By the way, some of them are so we sometimes have inverse relationship between, say, honesty and innovation. So sometimes being very innovative, and it's something that Israeli culture likes to celebrate, could be negatively correlated with ethicality. So some of those things are going together, and we need to understand that as well.
I think this is a great segue into your deeper research about behavioral ethics, because that's a very tantalizing point that you just made, that somehow less honesty is positively correlated with more innovation, but it's probably a different topic. But I do think it's interesting for you to explain to us what is behavioral ethics and your point of view on it that really drills down to why most people commit crimes. So maybe start with explaining the field, and then we can go into what causes us to transgress.
Right. So behavioral ethics is a field that tries to understand, as you suggested, why wrongdoing is so prevalent in society. So sometimes this notion of good people doing bad stuff, the idea is that in many situations, many normative people will end up behaving unethically without fully understanding that what they do is problematic. So if the classical assumption of the legal system is that once we put a high price tag for undesirable behavior, many people will not engage in those behaviors. So like in economics, right? If you raise the price of a product, fewer people will buy the product. This is kind of the leading assumptions of rational choice accounts of law. Behavioral ethics suggests that it's actually more complex because we have many mechanisms. Some of them are aware, some of them are unaware, that make it hard for ourselves to recognize the full extent of the legality and morality of our own behavior. And kind of the interesting challenge is to understand what will increase those processes and what will decrease. So understanding in what situations we're going to see more of those mechanisms causing people to misunderstand or underestimate their own ethicality. Once we recognize those situations, we need then to ask what can states do to enhance people's ethicality, so to enhance their awareness to the meaning of the ethical meaning of what is it that they do, which we argue might improve their overall behavior.
So the idea is that people often break the law, not because they are bad people who don't care about morality, but because they rationalize the morality of what they're doing, or they rationalize that they are being a little immoral for the moment, even though, in other words, most people don't commit crimes because they lack a moral compass, but because they are justifying some sort of transgression. Is that part of the argument?
This is part of the mechanisms. I mean, some of the mechanisms are such where people actually do not see what is it that they do. So we have mechanisms such as motivated reasoning or moral forgetting or motivated seeing. All of those suggest that when people are motivated, their cognition might not really see the full meaning of what they do, or people might forget that they even got these restrictions, or they will not even notice the meaning of what they do. So, for example, if the government is saying, okay, we're going to crack down on corruption, and everyone who is corrupt going to go to jail, if I don't feel corrupt, it's not going to affect me, right? I need to be able to see my own corruption for me to care about the new law about corruption. And this is, in a sense, much of what I'm trying to do in my research, to kind of help policymakers recognize that it's not just enough to announce what you need to do. You need to make people understand that what they do is the behavior you're trying to prevent. And there are actually good mechanisms, right? I mean, in a sense, the whole notion of the self-serving mechanisms, those mechanisms that cause us to view ourselves in a better way than we really are, it's actually very helpful. I mean, depressed people are less likely to have self-serving mechanisms, right? I mean, so it's good for us, in a sense, to view ourselves as being more moral or more law-abiding than we really are. But in the context of ethics and compliance, it has externalities on other people. So if I'm unable to see that what I'm actually doing is illegal or harming other people, we need to intervene and fix that. So this is kind of, I think, the challenge between behavioral ethics and legal policy, to understand the mechanisms and to be able to come up with solutions that will reduce this kind of unethicality.
Do you think that this tendency to, all these mechanisms that, we take to rationalize and basically carry out these transgressions, is any of that exacerbated by the decline of trust in science, in experts, in, the decline of the regime of truth, factuality, all those things that have characterized the last couple of decades and we care a lot about in the sense of the public discourse? Are they connected in any way?
I think they are connected through the concepts of ambiguity. So generally speaking, the more room you have to view reality as ambiguous, you have more kind of what's called the moral wiggle room to interpret reality in a way which will fit your own views. So even I think in the COVID case, it's very easy for people to pay more attention to the scientists saying it's only a flu, and then feel that there's nothing immoral about them going around without face masks. So the kind of this distrust in science and in fact, in a sense, I think allow for some subjective views of ambiguity, or sometimes it's called constructive ambiguity, where you could actually find ambiguity even in places where there isn't an ambiguity, but it allows you to feel good about your own wrongdoing. So if you can say, what I did was not really what they meant. And we see it a lot in the legal culture, where sometimes policymakers like to impose standards. Standards are kind of words like reasonable or good faith, right? We know what it means, but this could be interpreted in more than one way. And the problem from behavioral ethics perspective is that if people have this interest in thinking that, I can hire this guy, although I know him, whatever, and the rule that prevents me from doing it is somewhat ambiguous, or use kind of language which I can interpret in more than one way, our research or my research suggests people will choose that interpretation. So people will choose the interpretation that what they do doesn't violate the legal rule. And so the challenge here is for the legal policymakers is to fight those ambiguities, to reduce them. So both for science and both for the legal system and in many other contexts, the more ambiguity you allow to kind of be in the public discourse, you see more exploitation of it, even sometimes without awareness. But people will say, oh, it's not really clear, and so I might as well do it and feel great.
And just to point out that that's something I've observed a lot in the field of conflict resolution. The whole concept of constructive ambiguity has been considered something to help build bridges in the negotiation process, but often doesn't lead to the best results because each side exploits it. I want to ask you how the concept of self-interest underpins your analysis, because we talk about people voting in their self-interest or maybe behaving with this new, complex, difficult set of regulations around corona in ways that reflect their self-interest. But what is self-interest? I mean, in Israel, we have people fighting for the right to become infected and to infect each other. How do you understand self-interest in your behavioral ethics analysis?
It's a great point. I think there's so much research trying to understand what's self-interest. For sure, it's not what economists think about self-interest. And this is, again, kind of a fight there is between kind of behavioral scientists and economists is trying to understand whether indeed or how important is money within our understanding of self-interest.
This is a great disagreement for political analysts as well, who think, why would people vote against their economic self-interest?
Right. And I think the over-focus on money lead us to really bad policies. So if we believe that self-interest is mostly about people enhancing their own financial well-being, we might ignore so many other self-interests which might be more problematic and even harder for people to recognize. So if we focused on, the context in which we have a lot of discussion about self-interest is conflict of interest, which could be either in administrative law or in corporate governance, where we have directors and we want them to focus on the interest of their shareholders. So now we speak about the stakeholders, so like environment and so on, and not on their own self-interest. And then the question is, what is the corporate actor's self-interest? Is this just about the money? So we're going to say you are in conflict of interest only if you can gain money from certain behavior which might harm the firm and at the same time benefit you. Or conflict of interest could also happen when your own interest is glory or self-esteem or feel that you are respected or recognize your own contribution. And in those conflict of interest, which sometimes could be more destructive, mainly because no one cares about them. So the feeling is that unless you got money to your pocket, then we don't like to see that as problematic. It's actually, I don't know if you want to get into the Bibi affairs, but some of them are related to positive media coverage, right? And many people will say, you can't really indict someone from giving some regulatory benefits for someone writing a positive column about them in the newspaper, right? I mean, we only recognize something problematic. Show me someone going with an envelope with cash, then I can see the interest. So positive media coverage or inviting someone to be a keynote speaker, and corporations, not just in political context, they do it in the medical industry. I mean, they know how to understand people's real self-interest. In many cases, it's not a self-interest assumed by legal policymakers, and by this kind of gap, we end up really corrupting people and having them behave not either in the best interest of the shareholders or in the best interest of their patients, because they care about other interests, but those other self-interests are not necessarily monetary or economic.
What can you say about translating all that to the legal realm and to lawmaking, the actual fact of lawmaking? Because much of what we say has to do with, with psychology, with culture, with abstract notions of how people perceive themselves and their relationship with society at large. And, laws at the end of the day are, in a way, do's and don'ts. And now here it seems like you're talking more about things that are like the spirit of the law and maybe things that are more, long-term than actual, passing of certain laws. How does it translate into the actual act of lawmaking?
So I think it translates to few aspects of legal policymaking. One is kind of what's called the regulatory toolbox. So what are the regulatory interventions you're going to focus on? Is it only what's called command and control? So again, assuming people can follow orders, you just tell them this is what you need to do. Or you could engage in more innovative, what's sometimes called self-regulation. So there is this concept called nudge, right? It's a famous book by Kasanstein and Thaler from 11, 12 years ago that focus on kind of how policymaker can change people's behavior just by making small changes in the environment or by grabbing people's attention. So again, if we recognize that a lot of the wrongdoing could happen because people don't understand, helping them understand it in the right moment could actually make a huge difference without any sanctions or enforcement or something like that. Because now if we understand how people make decisions, we design regulatory tools which are supposed to help that. Or have other projects where we engage in pledges, right? So we show that the government can trust people more if they allow business people to sign a pledge promising to behave in a certain way, which will lead them to compliance with less need to resort to kind of ask them, show me all the evidence you have for opening a new business or all the documentation or all those things. So in a sense, understanding how people make the decisions, I think allows policymakers to use a much larger tools. So you can focus on social norms. You can focus on changing the social meaning of certain behavior. There are so many other things you could do to change behavior if you understand what's underlying their unethical behavior. So what causes, why they do it, how they think about it. If you understand it, you can come up with the interventions which will be more fine-tuned to the given situation or a certain context, much better than just kind of simply using all the time only this hammer of, okay, let's penalize you and we're going to solve everything. So this is, in a sense, one aspect. The other is also related, for example, to the need to have people understand what they need to do. So again, recognize that if people understand, if people, and this is also, I think, a problem in the COVID context. If people know why is it that they need to do it, they're more likely to do it. And this is also related to this kind of perception of people. People are complex. They have all those kind of conflicting forces within them. And if you want to change their behavior in the long term in a sustainable way, you need to, in a sense, have them be your partners to some extent. And they will be your partners only if you respect them, if they feel trusted, if they feel that you are doing everything you can to help them, then they will reciprocate and help you in return. All of this kind of is in a sense a paradigm shift in how states should govern, given what we know about how people make ethical decisions.
Okay, I love this view of humanity because it gives a lot of faith in the essence of human trust, human ability to react to information, and it makes sense. But I think as we have to wrap up soon, but how much of this is different in different cultures and different countries? And maybe Israel is just a rebellious people who just don't like following rules and prefer to scoff at your laws. And even within any one community, as we know in Israel, and not only in Israel, there are some people who would react exactly the way you are finding in your research, and others who say, well, I make my choices differently. I don't believe in your science. I believe that God will help me and I can have all the weddings I want. How much of your research really can be applied universally?
Well, this is why it takes so many years and there's so many people working on it. There's definitely no easy solution. And I think, again, I disagree that this is an Israeli problem. I think in every country you have a lot of complexities. So I think if I need to kind of sum up, there is a pessimistic view and there is an optimistic view. So the pessimistic view is in a sense that it's not just bad people who do bad stuff. And because all of us in the right situation will behave badly, we need to be on alert. So in that regard, this is a pessimistic message. So when you say you love my view on humanity, in many ways I'm saying, you should suspect everyone. And everyone could behave badly if in the right situation. And again, a lot of my research try to identify the situation in which so many people might behave badly. At the same time, we also focus on the solutions. And the optimistic side is that some of those solutions are not hard to implement and many people will very easily change their behavior. Now, the notion of kind of maybe I think what you're referring to is heterogeneity. So the fact that not all the population in Israel or in general will react to the same policies. And if we trust people too much, some people will exploit it and some people will flourish. And I think the paradigm that I rely on is called responsive regulation, which basically offer kind of some sort of a sequential way of governments to approach people. So in a sense, the idea is that you start with kind of softer means. So you try to convince people, you try to grab their attention. If they don't pay attention, you ask them again. Increasingly, you will end up in a situation, and I'm just making up the number, 70% of the public will cooperate with you only if you use, enough if you use kind of the softer means. Then you're going to get to certain parts of the population where you need harsher means. But then it's only a portion of the population. So then you can use the harsher means, and I definitely not against the usage of sanctions. In fact, I have research that shows that being too nice to people is also problematic because they might view it as a weakness or that you're going to forgive everything.
Don't I know it?
Right. So I don't want the kind of work I do to be interpreted as, let's just kind of trust people and everything going to be great. I mean, definitely, I really like the Roosevelt kind of statement about speak with a soft voice, but hold a big stick. I think you can gain the trust of most people and gain their value to cooperation using the soft voice. But I think even for them, they need you as a policymaker to see the stick because they want to know that those who will not cooperate are going to get the stick. So the stick is important, but you should, in a sense, hold it all the time, but use it in a sense as a last resort. And I think the responsive regulation and the pyramid of compliance, which is kind of a Braithwaite and Iris kind of paradigm, is very useful for the behavioral perspective of regulation.
You were speaking at the Eli Horowitz conference on economy and society that's organized every year by the Israel Democracy Institute in December. And I'd like to ask you if there's like one policy proposal that you think that the Israeli government should adopt to implement that principle of speaking with a soft voice and holding a big stick, what would it be?
I think what COVID taught the Israeli government are on the limits of sanctions and deterrence.
Of
and
the big stick.
I'm sorry?
Of the big stick.
Of the big stick.
Yeah.
So without making people recognize what they need to do, help them get their what's called kind of capacity to comply. So help people comply, cause people to trust your decision-making, make it as transparent, as professional, as far away from politics as possible. Without that, you're not going to get any behavioral change, not just in COVID, but also if you want to change people's behavior with regard to the environment or with regard to so many other aspects. I mean, I think COVID taught us that governments need the public trust and they need to work hard and they need to deserve it. And the public is very smart. I mean, we are a democracy, and people, and you have good journalists who will expose everything. So if you want the public to trust you, you need to earn it by being transparent and by making sure, especially when you speak about public health, but not just, be focused only on the science and make sure that the people see that what you do is only driven by those concerns. And I hope that those going to be lessons that will change how regulators and how legal policymakers think about laws.
More than giving people a lot of credit, you're giving the Israeli government a lot of credit. Professor Yuval Feldman, professor of law at Bar-Ilan University and a senior research fellow at the Israel Democracy Institute. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And also thanks to Itai Shelem, our producer, and once again to the Israel Democracy Institute for sponsoring this series. And now we've got a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review of any kind. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing to our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has more than 600 interviews. Like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast Ideas from Israel. And, of course, follow Dalia and me on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from Dalia and from me, goodbye.